Buenas tardes.
Good evening, and welcome to the Faith and Science Fundamentals webinar series. Thank you for joining us for the fourth session in which we will conclude our first module that has been dedicated to science. Scientists, Christians, and creationists. Part of the information that I'm using for this topic I borrowed from two books that for me are very interesting. The first one is it's this one right here, written by David Hutchins and Tom McLeish, and it is titled, Let There Be Science, Why God Loves Science and Science Needs God. And the second book is Scientists and God by Antonio Fernández Rañada. The first book is in English and the second one is in Spanish. If you would like to delve further into this topic, I would recommend these two books. But please remember that I said that they are interesting to me, but not that I agree with everything that they say. In the bibliography, as in life, it is important to follow Paul's advice to examine everything and retain the good. In the last two sessions, we talked about the relationship between science and religion. Today, we're going to delve a little bit further into this topic, but we're going to make it a little bit more personal. How do scientists relate to God? Well, the popular opinion is that they are not closely related. There is a general idea that scientists, by definition, cannot be religious people. It happens to me a lot that when a person who doesn't know me asks me what I do, and I tell them that I am a biologist and that I teach science and religion, they usually look at me with a strange or surprised face and ask, science and religion? How can they go together? Do they go together? This may be due to a simplified conception that we have already talked about. Many people think that science is based on evidence, while religion is based on blind faith, which makes them incompatible and science the superior. This idea can be seen in many memes that are circulating on the internet today, like this one. Faith does not give you answers. It just stops you asking the questions. Science adjusts its views based on what is observed. Faith is the denial of observation so that belief can be preserved. Too stupid to understand science? Try religion. Science does not care what you believe. Such disparaging claims about religion and intrinsic superiority of science is very common among the so-called new atheists, whose most famous representative is the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. Another well-known new atheist is the Oxford professor Peter Atkins, who, as we read in this quote, is very clear that one cannot be scientific and religious. It says, "It is not possible to be intellectually honest and believe in gods. And it is not possible to believe in gods and be a true scientist." I consider myself a scientist, but according to Peter Atkins' criteria, I am not a true scientist. I suppose that Mr. Atkins would have no problem in telling me to my face that I don't measure up as a true scientist. But I wonder if he would dare say the same to these people that you see here on the screen. I'm sure that you recognize some of these faces. We will discover their names throughout today's topic, but first I would like for us to review what we understand as to be a scientist. The dictionary definition says, one of them says, a person who studies science and dedicates time to research in one of the sciences. And if we search the word in Google Images, the scientist word in Google Images, all of the photos on the first page show someone in a white lab coat working in a lab. This is a very limited and contemporary concept of science. If Google Images had existed in the origins of modern science, the search would surely have given us very different results. Because the textbooks place the birth of modern science in Europe during the 16th century. Of course, before that time, many people from different cultures had studied nature in a way that we would call or consider scientific. And they made very important discoveries. For example, the Arabs, they were responsible for numerous advances in astronomy, optics, and mathematics. And in cultures like in the Chinese culture, this device was invented to predict earthquakes. Even in the Bible, we find accounts that fit the current notion of scientific study. Have you ever considered that the story of Daniel and his friends and the king's food is probably the first clinical study in history? It has all of the components. It's like it has a control group, a treatment group, a certain time for treatment, certain days, and at the end, the comparison of results between the two groups. But let's go back to Europe during the 16th century, where historians place the birth of modern science, that which is based on the scientific method, empirical evidence, experimentation, and observation, that which in principle has nothing to do with faith or science. Who were the first scientists? What was so special about these people who started modern science and changed the world? The book that I commented on before, Scientists and God, was written by a scientist who is a professor of physics at the Complutense de Madrid and president of the Royal Spanish Physics Society. In speaking of the birth of modern science, he says the following. Modern science owes a lot to medieval theology. What's more, it could not have arisen without a Christian tradition having prepared the ground for it. Science is based on the Christian belief in a God who not only created the cosmos, but also endowed them with order and made them follow certain laws. The world is not arbitrary, but intelligible. It has an order that can be studied. A world created by capricious God or under the dominion of several competing gods would not behave regularly and could not be studied or understood. And in this other quote, he talks about the first scientists. It says, the revolutionaries who founded science in the 16th and 17th centuries were sincere and deeply religious people who considered the investigation of God's action in the world as a normal part of their activity. So, at least in the beginning, science and scientists did have a lot to do with God and religion. What's more, they invented science to better understand how God worked in the world. This God of the Bible, the wise God, an orderly and powerful God who established the laws of the universe that they were eager to discover. Let's get to know some of these revolutionaries who founded science. We'll start with Nicolás Copérnico, the astronomer who proposed the heliocentric theory. Although he was not ordained a priest, Copérnico was a canon of the Frauenburg Cathedral, and he also studied law, medicine, Greek, and philosophy. It seems like at that time they weren't very clear about choosing between science and arts or between science and religion. Francis Bacon, this English philosopher and politician, who also studied law and science, is considered the father of the scientific method. He's the one who proposed that the only valid explanations in science are those based on observation and experimentation. We said this a lot already. But he's also the one who proposed the metaphor of the two books, the Bible and nature, which we talked about last week. And he's also the author of a quote that I like very much. It says, "God never wrought miracle to convince atheism, because his ordinary works convince it. It is true that a little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's minds about to religion." I must not be the only one who likes this quote because several later authors have paraphrased it. But it is very true. We might think that scientific advances make God unnecessary because they explain the natural causes of things that were previously attributed directly to God. But when we look at the implications of the laws of nature, how complicated everything is and how well done it is, it brings us back to God with even more admiration. René Descartes. Surely you have all heard the famous phrase from this French philosopher and scientist, "I think, therefore I am." Descartes is famous for being a pioneer for modern thought. He argued that reason was the only valid criterion for truth and systematic doubt. You have to doubt everything. And yet, he believed that this does not apply to the Bible. Take a look at this quote. "And these two paths, intuition and deduction, are the most certain for science. All others should be rejected as suspect and subject to error. This does not prevent, however, that we believe everything that has been revealed by God as more true than all other knowledge." So we have to doubt everything except what God has revealed. Let's continue with Johannes Kepler, the German astronomer who discovered the laws of planetary motion. Kepler wanted to be a theologian because, as he said in his own words, look at this, he wanted to penetrate the mind of God and think his thoughts. But he realized that he could know and honor God through science. Kepler describes the world as a temple of God, the study of nature as an act of worship, and astronomy as the priesthood. The next one we all know very well. Isaac Newton, one of the most famous scientists in history. He was a physicist and theologian, and his writings on religion far surpass his scientific writings. He didn't actually keep the two fields separate. For Newton, natural philosophy, which is what science was called then, had as its fundamental mission the study of the relationship of God to his work. In his famous book, Principia, he includes strong religious claims like this one. In it, in God, all things are contained and move, but without mutual interference. God suffers nothing from the movement of bodies. They do not experience any resistance to the omnipresence of God. It is recognized that a supreme God exists always and everywhere. You know that Newton's laws deal with the interactions of bodies in motion. Well, he wants to emphasize here that they do not affect God even though he is everywhere. One more example. Robert Boyle is considered to be the first modern chemist and who, it turns out, was also a prominent Christian theologian who contributed significant sums of money to missions and the translation of the Bible into different languages. Like Kepler, Boyle viewed scientific research as an act of worship. So far, the examples that we have seen are of scientists from the 16th and 17th centuries who lived in a predominantly religious society, so it is only logical that they too were religious. But what happens when the 18th and 19th centuries arrive with the Enlightenment, the theory of evolution, and other factors that secularize European society? Is that when scientists break with God? Let's find out. Here we have Leonard Euler, who was one of the greatest mathematicians in history and the best theoretical physicist of the 18th century. He is responsible for giving Newton's theories their final form. An analytical mind that nonetheless was concerned with religious matters. He was especially interested in the origin of evil. He wondered, well, if God is good, why is there so much evil in the world? And his answer was human free will. He also wrote about prayer. What is prayer for? Does prayer make God change his mind? Do you realize that the issues that preoccupied these great minds are the same that concern us today? Another interesting case is that Joseph Priestley, the English chemist who discovered oxygen. This man was a pastor of the Anglican Church and defended the argument that science and religion are essentially concordant and that the apparent conflicts that arise are because Christianity was corrupted when it admitted the Greek influence of dualisms between spirit and matter against the biblical tradition. Someone perhaps better known, Michael Faraday, one of the discoverers of electromagnetism and considered by many to be the best experimental physicist in history. Faraday belonged to a Sandemanian church, Christian church, where he was a priest and often preached. One of his favorite texts was Romans 1:20, and he quoted it a lot, and not just in church. In 1854, he used it when he addressed the prince consort before the royal institution, saying, I believe that the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. And I have never seen anything incompatible between those things of man and which be known by the spirit of man which is within him, and those higher things concerning his future which he cannot know by that spirit. Faraday was also fond of the metaphor of the two books. He said that, for the book of nature, which we have to read, is written by the finger of God. His spiritual life was so integrated with the rest of the facets of his life that it permeated everything. His friend John Tyndall, who was an agnostic, said of him, the contemplation of nature and his own relation to her produced in Faraday a kind of spiritual exaltation which makes itself manifest here. His religious feeling and his philosophy could not be kept apart. There was a habitual overflow of the one into the other. His weekday strength and persistency might be referred to his Sunday exercises. He drinks from a fount on Sunday, which refreshes his soul for a week. I would love to have my scientific friends say something similar like this about me. Well, we could go on for hours quoting great scientists of all ages, but who not only believed in God, but were deeply religious and considered science and religion to be perfectly compatible. But that must have been in the olden days, because nowadays, scientists really don't believe in God. Is that not right? Well, I would like to invite you to take a look at this website. It's the list of Christians in science of Wikipedia, the list of Christians in science and technology. There you can find all the scientists that we have talked about and many more. Hundreds of them. But the list doesn't end in the 19th century. If you keep on going, you will see that includes the 20th and the 21st centuries. And the last part of the list is where you can find Christian scientists who are alive today. The people on this list meet two conditions. First, they are famous scientists who have made important discoveries or form part of world-class scientific institutions. And second, they are people who openly declare themselves religious and who advocate compatibility between science and religion. I invite you to explore this list on your own, but I would like to draw your attention to a few of the names that appear in the last section. Christian scientists who are alive today. This is William Cecil Campbell, Werner Arber, William Daniel Phillips, and Gerard Ertl. All of them are Nobel Prize-winning scientists. All of them are Christians and believers in God. As I was saying earlier, I would like to know if Peter Atkins would dare to tell these people that they are not true scientists. Another person from this section of the list that I would like to stop on for a moment is Francis Collins. Francis Collins is an American geneticist. He is the director of the U.S. National Institute of Health and was the director of the Human Genome Project. In addition to his many scientific achievements, Collins is known for having created the BioLogos Foundation, which advocates for compatibility between science and religion. Also, he has written a book entitled The Language of God. Francis Collins is an interesting case because he is an atheist, or he was an atheist, who converted to Christianity. So he is a living example against two misconceptions that are going around. First, that scientists cannot be Christians, and second, that Christianity does not convince highly educated people. But this isn't the only case. I'm sure that you all know the story of Anthony Flew, a staunch defender of atheism who in the last years of his life changed his position and came to define himself as a deist, explaining that he found powerful arguments for the existence of God in recent scientific discoveries. Another lesser-known case is that of Alistair McGrath, an Oxford professor who was an atheist as a young man and was convinced that anyone who believed in God was mentally deficient or insane. But now, he's a biophysicist and theologian, an Anglican priest, and a Christian writer of great influence around the world. I hope that with all of this evidence, it has become more clear that being Christian and a scientist is not only possible, but that it was very common in the history of science, and it is still common today. Of course, there are many scientists who are atheists, agnostics, indifferent, and of non-Christian religions. But the issue under discussion today is not that all scientists have to be Christians, but the idea is that one can be Christian and a true scientist. Well, today's topic is actually scientists, Christians, and creationists. But we haven't talked about the last word yet, creationists. The first thing that we would need to do is to define creationist. To keep it simple, we will say that a creationist is a person who believes that the biblical account of the origins tells what really happened. That is, that God created life on earth a few thousand years ago in one week of literal days. We'll just say that. Okay, so among the scientists we have spoken about today, we can say that the former were undoubtedly creationists in the first centuries, 16th and 17th. But with the passage of time, many Christian scientists have changed their way of understanding the origins. In the next module, we'll see the different perspectives that exist about the origin of the world and of life, and how many Christian scientists on the list defend some kind of intermediate position that can be included within the general term theistic evolution. That is the case of Francis Collins, for example. But not all Christian scientists think this way. Not everyone is a theistic evolution believer. Here you have my colleagues from the GRI. And we've talked about Leonard Brand, Randy Yonker. All of us, myself included, are proof of this. But today, I want to end with an example of a Christian scientist and creationist who does not belong to the Adventist Church, so that you don't think that we are alone in this. This is John Sanford, an American geneticist famous for being the father of GMOs. John Sanford invented bioballistics, which is something like a gun that is used to inject DNA from one cell into another. I had the opportunity to meet Sanford personally when I was at Loma Linda. He is a great scientist, but also a very nice, humble person, a good Christian, and a convinced creationist. But the interesting thing is that he wasn't always like that. John Sanford says that in high school, he learned about evolution, and that made him become an atheist. As an adult, he began to attend church at the request of his wife, and he converted to Christianity. But due to his scientific training, he believed that the theory of evolution was strongly supported by the evidence, so for a time he accepted theistic evolution. But one day, he was asked to teach science classes at a Christian school and explain both sides, both options. So he began to research intelligent design issues and the arguments for literal creationism from a scientific view. And in his own words, what he has to say, that was his second conversion, realizing that there were powerful scientific arguments that favored literal and recent creation. And then he began to investigate on his own. Since his specialty is genetics, he began to study spontaneous mutations in human beings and discovered that the rate of mutation and the number of mutations that pass from one generation to the next is so high that the human species could not have been on Earth for hundreds of thousands of years because we would have already become extinct. We will talk a little more about this when we get to the biology module. But if you want to get ahead, Sanford has written a book called Genetic Entropy, where he explains the results of his research in detail. If the book is too much, you can also find summaries of this information, videos, and updates on the subject at the webpage that appears here, geneticentropy.org. I wanted to end with the example of Sanford because it reflects something of which I have been convinced for a long time. And that is, many scientists believe that abiogenesis and the theory of evolution are a good answer for the origin and development of life because they have not seriously considered that there is an alternative. There are many prejudices against religion and creationism, and most scientists have no idea of the arguments used by current creationists. I'm not saying that if they knew them, they would be convinced and they would all become creationists. But I do believe that if evolutionary scientists gave the other side a chance and tried to understand it, they would realize that it is something serious. that there are good arguments and good ideas, and perhaps meeting spaces could be created that could generate collaboration and fruitful research. Anyway, we will end today's session here in the module, our first module here, which we have dedicated to science. And next week, we will start the second module, Theories about the Origins.